Well, ladies and gentlemen, only really one news story that's really worth talking about today, and that is the news around Donald Trump and South Africa. Because the war of the words between Donald Trump and South Africa has escalated significantly. But before I get onto the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help, and if you'd like to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. Though I'd appreciate it if you just rather shared the video and got the video out to as many people as possible. That's all the thanks I need. So let's get on to the news article of today. Well, Donald Trump has said that the upcoming G20 summit in South Africa, he described it as a total disgrace, alleging that the host country being South Africa, is plagued by corruption and white unaliving, which he said was unacceptable. Now, the idea that the host country is plagued by corruption, look, even the ANC admits that South Africa is plagued by corruption, so no lies detected. Now, Trump barred all US government officials from attending, effectively boycotting the summit completely. Now, the original suggestion is that maybe Vance would go. Turns out Vance is not going now. In fact, no one's going. Now, the reason for this is because Trump accuses Pretoria of being anti-Western, anti-American, pro-Russia, and pro-China. And he's highlighted that South Africa's BRICS alignment and its arms ties to Moscow make it a liability to what he says the G20. Now, I can't really say that he's wrong, because South Africa has been deeply anti-Western, deeply anti-American, and deeply pro-Russian. I mean, none of this is actually a lie. Now, the move is seen as a major political disruption, isolating South Africa from the US just months before the GN is due to take place in Cape Town. Now, there was a suggestion that originally Cyril, remember he resigned some time ago during the Pala Pala scandal and he stayed on. Well, there was a suggestion that he only really stayed on for the G20. And to be honest, the G20 is now looking like an absolute joke. So the news that he may not last after the G20 and he may step aside or resign doesn't really come as a surprise to anybody. Now, the presidency has responded dismissively, saying that South Africa is ready to host the G20 with or without the US. Ramaphosa's office said that Trump's comments were unfortunate and baseless, emphasizing that preparations for the summit are on track. But we have to ask the question as to what exactly was baseless. Was it the white unaliving, or was it the corruption? Because in terms of the corruption-plagued country, well, that's actually a fact. Nobody is disputing that. Now, the government reaffirmed that South Africa's foreign policy is, and I quote, independent and not dictated by Washington or Beijing. Although news of the weekend was that Beijing has access to all of our military bases and they're basically doing some upgrades for free. And that means that they now know everything that's going on in South Africa militarily, which has caused a ruckus in Parliament. So we have to say, well, independent said who? In any case, officials underscored that the summit would proceed as planned and that G20 parties, including the EU and China, remain supportive. Of course, China remains supportive. They're part of the reason that you're arguing with the US in the first place. Now, the ANC's Secretary General, Fikile Mbalula, fired back at Donald Trump, saying that the G20 will take place with or without him. And he accused Trump of spreading what he described as white unaliving myths and neo-colonial misinformation. Now, that neo-colonial stuff is exactly why Trump says that South Africa is anti-Western, because we've heard this neo-colonial stuff for a very long time from the ANC. Now, Mbalula says that the US boycott proves that Washington cannot stomach an African-led global conversation. And I don't think that it's the African-led global conversation that they're worried about. It's coming to South Africa and being lectured about reparations and racism and whatever else. That's what they're worried about. Now, his remarks have been covered widely. That's Mbalula's remarks. But these are risking deepening tensions and risk alienating Western investors, because, you see, the ANC wants to act tough, but Western investors are watching them shut their mouth off and thinking, look, we don't really want to be with these guys. They are not the good guys. Now, DIRCO, the Department of International Relations, has issued a statement rebuking Trump's allegations as recycled disinformation. Because remember, Ramaphosa went to the US, he was told about the White Boer genocide, if you want to call it that, and they were told at that point in time by South Africa, well, it's not happening. And the reality is Trump didn't buy it. So now, according to DIRCO, well, that means that Trump is still believing the disinformation. No, he's just not believing you, DIRCO, because he just doesn't trust you, because you're full of corruption and you lie. Now, DIRCO's reiterated that the whole ethnic persecutions of Afrikaners have no factual basis, in calling it part of a long-run campaign to undermine South Africa's image internationally. And to be honest, didn't really need the US to do that. All they have to do is look at the corruption that goes on in South Africa, and that does it all for the ANC and for the US. Now, DIRCO added that South Africa remains committed to its constitutional democracy and human rights framework, including protection for all minorities, unless you're Jewish, and then you can go to hell. Now, the GNU over the weekend met and reportedly agreed to forge a new pathway on foreign policy. Now, the idea is that they want to balance relations with the West and the BRICS nations. Now, there's a reason for this, and that is that the US doesn't actually trust the ANC. They say the ANC, being communist aligned, typically tends to side with, well, communist countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, China, Russia, even though Russia's not actually communist anymore, but it was once. And none of that's actually wrong. South Africa does tend to align itself with those parties. But the DA, well, the US trusts the DA, and the DA wants to be pro-Western. That's the EU, it's the Americas, the Canadas, the Australias, and so forth. So the idea now is that there is internal disputes within the GNU who have accused the ANC of continuing to use its existing foreign policy. And that's true, they haven't changed course. And the DA specifically and the IFP are pushing for pro-Western stances amidst the ANC defending itself as being non-aligned. Now, obviously, the DA and the IFP say, well, if you're truly non-aligned, you should be able to create relations with the Western powers and not just sitting there all the time shutting your mouth off about neo-colonial powers. And there's a degree of truth in that. Now, analysts say that this all marks an attempt to repair Western relations amid fears of sanctions or G20 disruptions. Now, we've already talked about the G20 disruptions, but the reality is that the only party who could effectively repair relations with the West is the DA or the IFP, but nobody is trusting the ANC. ANC claims it's not aligned. That's just nonsense. We all know it. Now, you see, part of the reason that we have so much corruption in South Africa, and part of the reason that the economy is in ruins, is because of the ANC's policy framework. But you see, Cyril Ramaphosa appeared in Parliament this week and defended his administration's policies amid fierce attacks, because everybody is saying to him, we know that your policies have destroyed the place. Now, he argued that the coalition government remains stable, that's the GNU, despite tensions over corruption scandals and economic stagnation. But with all of that being said, Ramaphosa reaffirmed his commitment to land reform, job creation, infrastructure revival, using his transformation-type policies. And he's calling all the political parties to have some form of unity ahead of the G20 Summit, because he already looks like a moron, because the US is already boycotting it. So what he doesn't want is he doesn't want there to be political party fallout as the G20 is occurring, because it'll make it look like the country is divided, and even though the country very much is divided. But here's the dilemma. He says, well, we're a GNU, we all take consensus from others, but the ANC's policy is what you're going to have to follow. He says that we're not aligned in terms of our foreign policy, but then says you have to follow the ANC's foreign policy, even though the DA and the IFP suggest that we should follow Western powers and suitably align ourselves with those parties. So what that actually shows you is that in reality, the ANC continues to govern as if it is still the sole party in power, as if somehow they won the election, but they didn't. Now, Mbalula himself did a controversial interview at the weekend, and he admitted that land expropriation without compensation would likely cause white people to flee South Africa but said that it must happen anyway. But this is curious, you see, because we know that one of the issues Donald Trump raised as a concern for South Africa was EWC. And Fikile Mbalula himself says that EWC will cause mass immigration from white people. But it's going to happen anyway because that's an ANC policy. So we have a situation where the ANC is saying, well, all of the suggestions made by Donald Trump are lies, but they know that if they do this, it's going to cause white flight and white people are going to flee, so they're going to do it anyway. But the US is lying when it said that you're stealing white people's land? Is the ANC not listening to itself? Because it sounds like it's schizophrenic. Now, Mbalula warned that if Section 25 were amended further, the country would collapse like Zimbabwe. But despite this, he says that land reform is inevitable and essential to restoring justice, drawing sharp criticism from opposition parties and business leaders. Because everybody knows the ANC cannot be trusted with anything. If you give them any form of EWC Act and you allow them to expropriate, they'll do it for nothing more than self-gain. They'll do it for nothing more than vengeance, because that's the way the ANC works. Now, this has led various legal scholars to suggest that South Africa's true crisis is not inequality or race, but an entrenched oligarchy controlling politics, business, and the judiciary. Because effectively, the same elites in South Africa have ruled since 1994. They've manipulated the democratic processes for personal gain, whilst impoverishing the majority. Now, the only way to get rid of this is for a complete political alignment away from party loyalty and towards decentralization and accountable government. So effectively what the DA suggests that we should have. But you see, the ANC is never going to go for this because South Africa is an entrenched oligarchy and has had an entrenched oligarchy through ANC policy. So it's interesting that this is the exact reason we say that you cannot give EWC to the ANC, because they will use it to enrich themselves. We all know this to be true. But the ANC talks with forked tongues. We have a GNU, but you must follow ANC policy. We have a consensus of parties, but you must follow ANC foreign policy. There's no white Boer Afrikaans genocide going on. But then they say effectively that they're going to do forms of EWC, even though EWC was one of the things raised by Donald Trump as being problematic for white people, but they're going to do it anyway because who cares? Yeah, the ANC doesn't know what it's talking about. They just talk nonsense. And then they say that Trump is the one that's full of disinformation. I don't think the ANC knows what it's on about. They just seem to be at the end of their tether with nothing intelligible to say any further. At least that's my views. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.